This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. A question I get asked a lot during the year, or sentiment that I hear a ton of in the comment section when it comes to talking about what Deshaun Watson is going to do this year, is 5,000 passing yards. And it is seen as this great milestone. Getting 5,000 yards usually means that you had a great season. And I think a lot of people want Deshaun Watson to not just have a good season, not just have a really good season, but have a great season, a season that will get him back in the MVP conversations and really elevate this franchise by having a quarterback in the echelon that we really have never had, right? Like, I don't know where Bernie Kosar was considered during his playing time, but from what I grasp, he was seen as a really good quarterback. He was never seen as one of the elite quarterbacks in the NFL. And that's something that the Browns have not had consistently for a very long time. We just have never had that era of having one of the best 5 quarterbacks in the NFL at its time, especially in this era where it matters much more than it did back in Bernie or Brian Sipes' time. Quarterback's always been important, but it just means more now when the game is more passing focused. So 5,000 yards is a number that a lot of people are fixated on. And I'm going to say this. Not only do I not think that Deshaun Watson is going to get 5,000 passing yards, I actually think that's a good thing if he doesn't, because 5,000 passing yards can mean one thing, but I think sometimes 5,000 passing yards is a result of other things going wrong. Not all the times. You have to look at some of the context, but sometimes. And stats can be kind of weird like this at times, right? We want one number to give us a perfect reflection of who that player is, and if that player is what we feel like they are, what we think that they are, what we want that player to be. But oftentimes numbers aren't that clear. You just can't make a point based off of one number, and some positions are harder to quantify than others. Like running back is one of the easier positions to quantify. It doesn't take much to understand if a running back is actually good at his job, because you can look at the rushing yards. The rushing yards look good. Okay, let's look at the yards per carry. If the yards per carry are above 4.5, then you're pretty good there. That's a really good running back. Usually, if those two things match up. Sometimes you even got to look at the tape. Like, if those two numbers are matching up, I promise you, he's probably really good, especially if the attempts are high. Like, yeah, that running back is really good. Wide receiver is another one where it's not super complicated, right? You could kind of look at receiving yards and that might tell you the story. There are more advanced things you can look at if you're trying to like get to the margins of who's the best wide receiver or who's elite. But if you're just looking for a good wide receiver, anybody who's capable of getting like 1,100 yards, you know, with semi decent efficiency, usually that stands to be true. Like it's not really that hard to find. But quarterback's one of those positions where there are so many statistics on what we measure with quarterback play, because it's so important that it actually becomes one of the most difficult positions to quantify, because we have so much data and because the position is so complex and relies on a lot of different variables. Now, one of those variables are you winning or losing in a game? We all notice if you're down multiple scores, you're not only taking more chances with throwing the ball, but you're also probably going to accumulate more yards because teams are going to be playing a lot of soft coverage on you when they're up by 12, when they're up by 20, when they're up by 21, 20. Like when they're up multiple scores, you know that you get the softer kind of cover 3 shell where they play soft underneath, let you have whatever you want there, maybe get a first down or two, and we call those kind of like garbage time yards. And those are easy to accumulate. So the passing yard total doesn't really tell the whole story with the quarterback position. Now, that being said, it's not like Kirk Cousins gets 5,000 passing yards in a season, right? This does not happen very often. I think there have been maybe 5,000 yard passers or something like that in the last 10 years. I don't have the exact number on me, but there haven't been that many. If I pull up the numbers, I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. We got 9 5,000 yard passers in the last 10 years. So why is it that I feel like Deshaun Watson getting 5,000 passing yards is not a good thing? Well, let's look at some of the common tropes between quarterbacks who have gotten 5,000 yards before. Now, obviously, this means you're going to have an extended amount of passing attempts, right? Tom Brady last year got to 5,000 yards by throwing the ball 720 times. I don't need to tell you the averages on that to let you know that that's ridiculous. But if you need a chart, know that 500 is about average. 600 is high. You know, those are passing offenses usually once you get above 600. 700 is insane. 700 is insane. If the like 720 passing yards, oh, not passing yards, my bad. 720 passing attempts in 17 games. That means he was throwing the ball on average 42 times a game. It's insane. It's a lot of throwing the football. It's more throwing the football than most people would. But that's what Tom Brady did. Most guys are able to get to 5,000 passing yards, though, you know, by throwing the ball about 650 times. You look at Pat Mahomes last year, 650 passing attempts. You look at Justin Herbert, 672. Jameis Winston, I know you forgot that he had a 5,000 yard passing season, 626 passing attempts. Pat Mahomes in 2018, and this is the biggest outlier. And again, I'll say this until it's not true. Pat Mahomes is an alien. He is that good at quarterback because he got 5,000 passing yards on 580 passing attempts, which I don't need to explain to you how insane that is. Ben Roethlisberger, 675. Drew Brees in 2016, 673. Peyton Manning, 659. Drew Brees, 650. So a lot of passing attempts are required, right? We're talking about everybody except Pat being in that kind of extremely high range. Once you get to 650, that is a passing heavy offense. And to that point, outside of the Pat Mahomes years, I think there have been 3 times. So 3 times in all of those examples that a 5,000 yard passer has had a 1,000 yard rusher. And it would also be important to point out that those 1,000 yard rushers for those years that the quarterbacks had 5,000 passing yards barely got over like 1,000 yards. Like I'm talking about like by less than like 75 yards, they got 1,000 yards. So not necessarily the most impressive rushing seasons are accompanying that. And also when you look at the yards per carry numbers for the running backs that accompanied these 5,000 yard passers, that's where some of this starts to become interesting, right? And again, the only one who breaks this motto is Pat Mahomes, and that's just kind of what he does. But Drew Brees in 2013, when he had 5,000 passing yards, his running game only averaged 3.8 yards per carry. Peyton Manning that same year, 4.1 yards per carry. Drew Brees, 4.3. Ben Roethlisberger, 4.2. Jameis Winston, 3.7. For those of you who don't know yards per carry numbers, I know there's a fallacy that tells you, oh, 3.5 yards per carry is good because you can run the ball 3 times and technically get a first down. I don't know who keeps pushing that out there. 3.5 yards per carry is an abysmal number. especially in today's NFL. And anything under 4.5 is below average at that point. Like you don't think a running back's good because they have 4.4 yards per carry. It's just not how we measure these things anymore. So Jameis Winston, 3.7 was his rushing game. That was 27th in the NFL. Justin Herbert was 19th in the NFL, his rushing game with 4.3 yards per carry. Tom Brady that same year, 20th, 4.3 yards per carry. And again, there are two outliers, right? Two teams that had really good rushing attacks, or at least top 12 in the NFL rushing attacks while having a 5,000 yard passer. And that's Pat Mahomes, both in 2018 and 2022. In 2018, Pat Mahomes, the rushing game that accompanied him, had 5.1 yards per carry. And in 2022, the rushing game that accompanied him, 4.7. But the only time you get over that league average mark, again, Drew Brees had the 26th ranked rushing game in yards per carry. Peyton Manning had the 18th. The only time you get over that Mendoza line of 4.4, 4.5 yards per carry when your running game is the 2 years of Pat Mahomes. And what this exposes to me is that throwing for 5,000 yards oftentimes is not a symptom of a healthy passing offense, but a result of a necessary and unhealthy reliance on your passing offense. Now, again, the only two that break this mold are Pat Mahomes seasons, and it's obvious to see why Pat Mahomes kind of breaks this mold, because not only is he able to get the type of passing yard numbers that you can get out of like Tom Brady throwing 720 attempts, but he can do them in significantly less passing attempts, right? Like even this year where he wasn't as efficient, he did it with 648 passing attempts. That's under most of what these guys were able to do it with, without having the giant number of interceptions that like Jameis Winston did when he got 5,000 passing yards with 626 passing attempts in 2019. But oftentimes, to get to 5,000 yards, that's more or less an indictment of the lack of ability you have as a football team to run the football. And that's the result of 5,000 passing yards. It's not necessarily unilaterally, and I would argue in most cases, it's not a great sign of a prolific passer. I really don't think that 5,000 yards should be used like that, but that's how it's used right now. But the evidence shows is like most of the times that these guys get to 5,000 yards. Now, granted, most of these guys are really good quarterbacks for it. We're talking about Tom Brady, Justin Herbert, Jameis Winston, Pat Mahomes 2 times, Ben Roethlisberger, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning. Like, you have to be a really good passer to get 5,000 yards in the NFL. Or Jameis Winston. But you have to be really good to get 5,000 yards in the NFL. But part of you getting 5,000 yards also requires that your running help has to be kind of bad. Unless you're Pat Mahomes, who can somehow get these ridiculous numbers without having the need for a bunch of passing attempts. Like, they're the only team that throws the ball as much as they do, not out of necessity, but just because it just works at a higher rate. But everybody else that's gotten to 5,000 yards, every mortal human that's gotten to 5,000 yards gets there because of necessity. Like, they need to get to 5,000 passing yards because they cannot move the ball on the ground. They're not efficient. Again, some abysmal yards per carry numbers, some abysmal rushing numbers, right? We're talking about out of 10 guys, only what? 2 1,000 yard rushers out of 10 5,000 yard passing seasons. That tells you everything you need to know. They're not good. And even those 1,000 yard rushers, 4.2 and 4.3 yards per carry. Barely at average. So I say all of this to say, and I think this is what I'm doing this week. I know what this is what I'm doing this week is I'm pointing out some of these arbitrary goals that we have for some of the players that we're very excited about in this Cleveland Browns team. Myles Garrett, Deshaun Watson especially. And I'm pointing out how these goals don't necessarily say about the player in the season that they're having what we really want it to say. At the end of the day, we want Myles to get 20 sacks, not because it would be this thing arbitrarily getting 20 sacks that would make us feel good even if the season went bad, but because what Myles Garrett getting 20 sacks says to us as fans is that he's producing at a high level, even though there are other ways to show that 20 sacks is the number that we can arbitrarily put on it that makes us feel like that. Same thing with Deshaun Watson getting 5,000 pass yards. That makes us feel like he's back. He not only is back, he improved on his 2020 season. But I'm here to say he can throw for significantly less passing yards than he did in 2020 and improve greatly. The passing yard should not be the bar in which he's measured. Honestly, it's the least relevant stat in which he's going to be measured in, right? Touchdown to interception ratio is probably going to be more important. I would say QBR is a little bit more important because it factors in some of these late game scenario situations. I would say a lot of other factors, bad throw percentage, big time throw percentage. These are the things that I think we can harshly judge Deshaun Watson on in total once we see what his body of work is going to be. But arbitrarily putting it at 5,000 yards and saying if he doesn't reach that number, it feels like a failure might miss the point of what we actually want, because sometimes arbitrary goals are that. Just arbitrary goals. They don't really mean or say what we want to have those things actually say. And I think with the 20 sacks with Myles Garrett, that's one of those examples where there are so many other ways that you could feel like Myles had a successful season without him getting 20 sacks. And with Deshaun Watson, I think it's even a bigger example of there are so many other ways he can have a successful season, even if he doesn't have insane passing yards numbers, because ultimately that's not what he's going to be judged by. Obviously, he's going to be judged by wins or losses, but he's also going to be judged by how those numbers help the team win. And passing yards, one of the more inflatable numbers for somebody to have. Just keep your eye out for that. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night.